So, day by day, we are creeping closer to Christmas, to the celebration of God coming among us. We are in the season of Advent still. This is week number 3, so we are getting closer. Um, we are going to continue in on Sunday, looking at this kind of combination of anticipation and waiting that defines Advent, especially from the Old Testament perspective, going into kind of the New Testament perspective, how some of that waiting, some of the ways uh, in which God is interacting with the world, and how that might affect us today. So this week we're going to focus a little bit more on kind of our Old Testament passage. I noticed this week that these last 3 weeks of Advent focus heavily on songs. Last week we had Zechariah's song and just this joy of God being among his people and the joy of his son John the Baptizer's part in what God was up to. Next week, we're going to look at Mary's song and her just joy of God kind of overturning the world in some ways. This week, we're going to look some at some of John's preaching, some other kind of passages in the New Testament that I think are responses to God among the world. But I was very struck by our Old Testament passage this week, which comes out of the kind of obscure book of Zephaniah, in which we yet again have what most people think is probably a song celebrating what God is doing among his people. And so this, in the third week of Advent, is the joy week. It's a week when we celebrate God amongst us, in the midst of an often dark and hard world, of course, lighting those candles. And so I thought this passage, particularly Zephaniah, just seemed to have the right feel for what we're going to look at this week. Some kind of just quick background on Zephaniah. We talked last week about the exile and how God's people had lost their homeland, and just the just kind of horror this was for their national identity, their understanding of who God was, the humiliation and the pain and the shame that came with that. Zephaniah is not after the exile. He's one of the thankless prophets who gets the job of warning people that this is coming and kind of knowing that things are not going to change, they're not going to get better. So he starts out with a very kind of dark, apocalyptic, you know, teaching and prediction of how bad this is all going to be. Interestingly, even though the vast majority of people didn't believe him, didn't really kind of change hearts and lives to a way of trusting God, one very important individual did, and that was the young king Josiah. A lot of people think that Zephaniah and some of his kind of doom and gloom preaching inspired this kind of last great revival among God's people, in which the kind of the doom that was coming is delayed by a generation or two, because Josiah heard this kind of doom and gloom preaching and recognized that it was not too late. God was still offering an opportunity. And again, he's not able to stem the tide ultimately, but it's interesting realizing that sometimes when things feel hopeless, we just don't know. We don't know the effects that they're going to have. And I suspect Zephaniah saw this and thought this. But the passage we're going to look at is one that's kind of beyond that point. He knows the doom and gloom is coming. He knows the exile and all the just devastation and pain that is coming. But he's also looking beyond that place of darkness, that purification, as we talked about both last week in Malachi's prophecy, but also in a lot of what Zephaniah is doing, of God using this pain and this darkness to kind of cut away the cancer in some ways. That infected his people, to purify them and make them whole. And the section I'm going to read is one that people have looked at and seen as a taste of what God is often doing among us. But it's also one that I think we are still waiting for. We are still waiting for its kind of ultimate fulfillment at the end of history. And so I'm going to read it to you. I just want to say, as I read this, listen for kind of the tone. Listen for the way this feels and maybe how shocking this would be at the end of a very kind of doom and gloom prophecy in which he knows things are going to go wrong for a while, but that ultimately does not, kind of define. And then I also want you to notice the kind of Christmas theme. The number of times in this section we're going to hear about God in your midst, God among us, God with us, that sort of language, which is, of course, so important for Christmas. So Zephaniah chapter 3, verses 14 through 20. Sing aloud, O daughter of Zion. Rejoice, O Israel. Rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away the judgments against you. He has cleared away all your enemies. The King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst. You shall never again fear evil. On that day it shall be said to Jerusalem, Fear not, O Zion. Don't let your hands grow weak. The Lord your God is in your midst, a mighty one who will save. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you with his love. He will exult over you with loud singing. I will gather those of you who mourn for the festival, so that you will no longer suffer reproach. Behold, at that time I will deal with all your oppressors. I will save the lame. I will gather the outcast. I will change their shame into praise and renown in all the earth. At that time I will bring you in, at that time when I gather you together. For I will make you renowned and praised among all the peoples of the earth, when I restore your fortunes before your very eyes, says the Lord. So this section, I want to go through a little more slowly because I think, aside from just being beautiful, there's some really important things it's doing here. So this very first verse, the kind of call, the invitation to rejoice is so important, but there's something that I think is very important to what Jesus would later do that's in here. So sing aloud, O daughter of Zion, shout, O Israel. That daughter of Zion, some people translate that daughter Zion. It's easy for us to miss the language God is using here is a parenting metaphor, right? We get so used to at times the way Jesus talks about God as God his Father, or even more intimately, Jesus saying Abba, Father, or Daddy, right? This very intimate, this very almost childlike way of talking about God. We can miss at times that is not how many people, even to this day, relate to God. That's not the way people think of God primarily. Maybe the primary way of thinking about God for many of us is maybe it's a judge, maybe it's a king and all their power, maybe it's a general or something that's big and powerful, right? A hurricane even. And yet again here, God is saying for this section, my daughter, my people, my children, my little ones, right? It's a parenting metaphor. And again, it doesn't always have to be male. It can be mothering as well, right? And there are sections in the Bible where God calls himself, herself, a mother, uses parenting metaphors again. And so it's easy to miss that. But, that's one of the things that Jesus got in trouble for, right? He didn't show enough proper respect to God. He was even accused of blasphemy for calling himself the Son of God, though, of course, we will, in the Bible shockingly discovered that is very accurately. This was, in fact, God among his people. But that's one of the biggest things Jesus is fighting for so much of the time with almost everybody about things, is his right to talk about God as his father, as his parent, as someone who is close and who is caring, rather than someone who is distant and powerful and expects people to behave a certain way primarily. And I think in the New Testament, they really tease this implication out, that Jesus fights for this way of understanding who God is, and that he extends through his work on the cross and his grace to us and in resurrection, etc., the right, the privilege of calling ourselves fellow siblings with him, of claiming children of God, and all the intimacy that comes with, of knowing that God is near us, of knowing God answers our prayers, that knowing God cares about the little things that no one else in the world does, but the claim that we're God's children, we're God's kids, and he cares. I mean, it also comes with that intimacy. It comes with the privileges of knowing who that is, and it comes with responsibility. And I think that's maybe a piece we make light of as well. It's not a responsibility for just sitting down and doing as we're told, although, as we've all been children, we all know there is a place for some of that. But that metaphor seems to be one to invitation to maturity, to understand what God is about and to do goddish things about in the world. And so this image of seeing ourselves as not just followers of God, not just obeyers of God, but God's dearly beloved children, and all the rights and intimacy as well as the responsibility that that implies is just a really beautiful and important thing. And you can just, off this kind of throwaway comment on the first one, sing aloud, daughter Zion, children of God, right? Moving into this next section, we're going to hear it again and again. God is in our midst. The Lord has taken away the judgments against you. He's cleared away your enemies. The King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst. You shall never fear evil. For on that day it'll be said of Jerusalem, fear not, O Zion. Let not your hands grow weak. The Lord your God is in your midst, a mighty one who will save. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you by his love. He will exalt over you with loud singing. And so this view of God among or in our midst, I think is a unique one among all religious understandings in world history, right? The metaphor almost always, and one that gets very literally used in some religions, is of like a mountain, right? If you try hard enough, if you climb, maybe you can climb up and be worthy of the attention of a distant God, a powerful God. And yet, here again and here, in your midst, among you, in your actual life, in the place, the claim of Christianity is not that we have to try really hard to climb to a distant God, but that God is not distant. He, in fact, came to us. Our work is not climbing to get to him. It's receiving the fact that he is right here among us. It's a very different approach, right? God is with you. God is in your midst. And if you've met most of the characters in the Bible, if you've met most of us who are stumbling along this thing called life, you recognize it's not that we're impressive people. We're not. We don't have answers. We're not saints in the kind of older sense of the word, right? We're just ordinary folks, just like they were in Jesus' day, whom God has drawn near, whom God is in the midst of. And just listen to the tone of this. What is it God is doing among us? He's saving people. He's rejoicing over people with gladness. He's quieting, shushing us from our tears. He's exulting, praising, proud of us. And I love that. And he's singing over us. This is not the image so many of us have of God, of this kind of like grudging toleration, like, oh, I guess they, jumped through enough hoops. They've been pure enough. I guess I got to let them in or tolerate them. There's a deep enjoyment that God is having here. And in the original language, it's interesting. It's a little hard to tell who is doing what. Who's rejoicing? Are we rejoicing in God's presence? Is God rejoicing over us? Are we supposed to be singing, or is God singing over us? Is God quieting us with his love, or is he enjoying himself in the quiet? And they have to translate it, of course, a way that makes sense so we can read it. But I just love, it's like the imagery here is this kind of, you could use some of the psalm metaphor. Is this, a mother holding a little baby who's just eaten, and you're just kind of blissfully, quietly enjoying one another's company? Is the singing here, two lovers who just don't have anything left to say? They're just kind of in ecstasy that they are together and they are so near. These are the kinds of metaphors I hear God using about himself amongst its people. It's just such a different view that God likes us and celebrates us and enjoys us. If we really believed that's who God is, if we really believe that that is the God that is among us and working, how different would our lives be? How different would our fears be? How different would our views of ourselves be? For me, this has been one of the big paradigms in my life. At a time I remember when I was just intensely lonely. I just didn't think I was particularly likable or lovable. And I understood, God is love, Jesus loves you, and this kind of thing. So yeah. He has to kind of put up with me because God is love. But God really took apart that hard, ugly view through passages like this and introduced just an intimacy and an enjoyment. I think God really likes me and is proud of me. And I'm most certainly not perfect, but I'm God's. And passages like this have changed me and given me a sort of a confidence not to continue to, be perfect in some certain way, but just to know how deeply I am loved. And my way through the world can have a very different way of being, one not defined by fear, one that sounds like this because I've experienced this in God. And that's my invitation for all of us to know who God is and who he says he is, to enjoy God in the same way he seems to like and enjoy us. I love this passage, right? I love how literally this actually came to be. In the Old Testament, they're thinking of the temple as God's presence, a special place you can go into to show that God is in our midst. That wasn't good enough for God. He had to make it even more obvious. He walked right out of that temple, took on our own weaknesses, our own limitations as a human being to show how close he is willing to become, to show just kind of the type of life he's constantly inviting us into, right? I love passages like this because it's shockingly literal in the New Testament, how God actually comes and how God shows up. And this last section, I think, is another really beautiful one. This dream ending that we're so scattered among the world, that we feel so isolated, that we feel so alone. At that time, I'm going to gather those of you who mourn for the festival, so that you will no longer suffer reproach. Behold, at that time I will deal with your oppressors. I will save the lame. I will gather the outcast. I will change their shame into praise and renown in all the earth. And at that time I will bring you in. At that time, when I gather you together, I will make you renowned and praised among all the peoples of the earth, when I restore your fortunes before your eyes, says the Lord. And so I think here just is that old dream, that restoration of Eden, of home, of belonging that we really originally had, of this deep longing for a community in which we know others and are known, right? I feel like it's just this ache we all have when we feel isolated, when we feel alone. And the promise is there's going to be a time when God gathers people back in, when he restores the unity, when we're a family together again, when we are just celebrating again what God has done. And I love this section again because who is it that he talks about gathering? It's not the best and the brightest. It's not those you would think a God like this would be tempted to gather. No, he says, I'm going to deal with your oppressors. I'm going to save the lame, the broken. I'm going to gather the outcast, the outsider, the losers, those with no value. And I'm going to change what everyone else calls shame about them, the things that they think they need to be ashamed of or they don't like about themselves. And I'm going to turn it into praise. And people are going to give them renown and glory over them. They're going to actually see them as they are meant to be seen. This again was so literally what Jesus spent his time doing. To people who were scattered, to people who were convinced that they were outside the family of God, that they had nothing to do with this God. He spends almost all his time not near centers of power, but in the wrong places, on the back roads, looking and finding and restoring sinners and blind people and literally lame people and outcasts and the broken, saying, come and enjoy. Let me show you what this life can be. And you can just hear this celebratory tone when everyone is gathered, when all things are made well again. And you saw Jesus living it, right? He celebrated really well. He partied a lot, often with the wrong people. He restored people and put back together the family of God in a way that was just almost offensive. How could this be true? How could God actually value people in this way? How could it actually be like this? And so I know I've spent a ton of time on this beautiful Old Testament passage. I don't want to neglect the New Testament passages, but I think in some ways they're just showing the two sides of a response. If you look at Paul's writing, it just reminds us in Philippians that celebrating and finding a deep joy in spite of the circumstances in life, that is an appropriate response to God coming among us and what he's doing. And the harsher teaching, the one out of Luke giving John the Baptist's, his teaching it's a little more difficult of a passage. It's harsher, but at the same time, it's a reminder that if this stuff is true, if this is who God truly is, we can leave some of those things behind. We do have a responsibility. We do have a response, which is going to look different for each of us, depending who we are and what that looks like. But not cheating the people around us, not seeing them as resources. That flows from a deep joy, a deep understanding of who we are in God, and that God is going to provide and God is going to continue to gather. And so I'm not spending a lot of time on those passages, even though there's a ton of good stuff there, because I see those as responses of truly believing, of truly understanding who God is and what he has to say about us. To me, what a wonderful thing to celebrate during this joy week of Advent leading up to Christmas, celebrating God in our midst.